Welcome to The Insurgency with me, Steve Baker, the podcast that helps you get beyond the mere gossip of Westminster to the factors that really influence all our lives. Joining me is the director of my Fighting for a Free Future project, Harry Richer. Harry, who have we got today?
Thank you so much, Steve. Today we have a rising star of political journalism in Westminster. He is the deputy political editor at The Spectator, their former diary editor, so he knows all the best gossip. Hopefully we're going to hear a lot of it today. It is our great pleasure to welcome today James Heale.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted, James, to welcome you. This is a big moment. The boot is on the other foot.
I'm worried. I'm stressed.
Of course you should be. And we have been doing our research.
Oh, gosh.
So what's this story about the nightclub bouncer and reciting the names of prime ministers? What happened?
Smears and lies. Get Carter Rock on it. Look, this is not my finest hour. I'm sure we'll be saying those words several times today. But basically, it was on a night out at Bristol, and I think I'd done the Coronation Tap Challenge, which is sort of 10 half pints of 10% cider, very strong stuff. And I went up to this bouncer at some club afterwards, and I was trying to get in, and to convince him of my sobriety and inherent decency, I said, I'm not drunk. I can name every prime minister since 1867, Second Great Reform Act. And at that point, he was sort of disbelieving. He was like, go home, mate. As I sort of reading off Disraeli, Gladstone, etc. So not exactly my finest hour, but I'm amazed that you've done more journalism today than me. So that's
well, there we go. We like to do our best.
Truly multifaceted.
What I'm really fascinated by is that you were able to do this great feat. I mean, there's not. How old were you at this time?
20, I'd say.
There's not very many people aged 20 who are that interested in politics. So is that what led you into journalism, this fascination with politics?
Well, mercifully for our birth rate crisis, most people are much more interesting than me and had much more fulfilled childhoods and adulthoods than being 20. I mean, look, yeah, that's my interest. Yeah, my interest in politics was stemmed by my love of history. And aged about I remember 15 was when the 2010 election, where you got elected, Steve, first happened. And that was sort of an awareness between the kind of forces that had been shaping the last few years. So the 2008 financial crash, I remember it vividly. My father works in the city. And then that relationship between sort of those forces and kind of how it affected people like myself. And then I really loved history, and I studied that at Bristol. And I then discovered in 2016, we were studying both the 1975 EEC referendum and, of course, we were living through the 2016 Brexit one. And, you know, the cliche, but journalism, the first rough draft of history. And I fell in love with it. And I thought, you know, stories of our time. For my dissertation, I went up and did it on Thatcherism. So I spoke to some members of Thatcher's government in the House of Lords. It was enormously good fun. And I thought, you know, you actually get to... I think Peter Hennessy, the great historian, had a line about the House of Lords like having lunch with your exhibits. You can go and meet the people you're writing about. And that's what I loved. And so history is about stories and about the narratives of our time. And I just fell in love with it.
And what was the most striking story that you heard from members of Thatcher's government?
I think it would probably be just how difficult some of those decisions were about the miners' strike. And I think that was probably, and I do wonder, you know, we're all very online, the three of us, in the age of Twitter, in the age of a lot of pressure, when we've seen governments repeatedly be forced to back down on different issues, whether we could get something like that. And some of those decisions, it was really sort of, the balance of power in this country was on an edge.
It really was, wasn't it? The balance of power was on an edge. Yeah.
We're probably coming to somewhere like that now, where similar difficult decisions are going to have to be made.
Yes.
And as you said, the question is, in the online age, will they be able to make them?
Well, quite. And I think that, you know, that's why, I mean, we're recording this actually 100 years to the day that Margaret Thatcher was born. And I do think there's many on the British right who see certain comparisons between the 1970s and 2020s. And part of the reason why things are so bad right now in this country are because a series of cumulative effects where I think governments have been unable or unwilling to deal with various challenges. And that's where we're paying the price for that. In that case, it was union militancy and a challenge to authority of the state. Right now, it's going to be different issues around sort of the relationship between the citizen and the state, and of course a whole generation with lost living standards as well.
And the affordability of the state, right? Because this
Absolutely.
is something we've talked about a great deal. You can see from the Office for Budget Responsibility figures and many others that we're heading into default as spending runs away with age-related spending. Now, what do you think your generation makes of all this? Does your generation, forgive me saying so, but I'm probably old enough to be your father, but what does your generation think about the level of state spending and unaffordability of it?
Well, I think the first answer is they prefer not to think about it in such a way when things are incredibly bad. Often you sort of throw yourself into other activities. But I think they feel pretty hard done by. They got a really rum deal from the social contract. I was born in 95. Obviously, we were the sort of first years that paid full whack for university fees, are sort of emblematic of quite a sort of difficult edge in terms of what we were getting out. And I do think that, you look at the level of social spending for other generations, it does seem that they've had quite generous state provision of certain services, education, health, welfare. And I just think people are pretty realistic, actually, say, oh, we work until I'm 70, 75. They're not expecting the triple lock, shall we say, in the 2060s, 70s and 80s.
No, okay. Harry?
Yeah, no, I think what's really interesting there is the expectation aspect, because I think people, we're the same age.
Yeah.
Same age rather. I've been lucky enough.
You've aged better than me.
No, I've been lucky enough to know you since we met on Freedom Week, which I've described as libertarian summer camp. To many boos when I say that. But I think it's the expectation is the real key aspect. Like I certainly used to be more optimistic. I think we all used to be more optimistic. Yeah. But as things have only progressively got worse, our generation's expectations really, really, really are negative now. Yeah. And I think one of the big questions is, can those expectations change? And will policy force those expectations into even worse way? We see polling showing the number of young people who now don't support democracy or support an authoritarian government. I mean, do you think that young people, it's just such a frustration with the entire system, they're now willing to accept a totally different system?
I think you can see that manifest itself throughout all of the political levels of voting. I think that people gave Boris a huge majority in 2019. They gave Labour one in 2024. The polls today would suggest they give Reform one. And I think there is that kind of sense of, perhaps particularly as sort of we've had with great services such as Amazon, you can order something, it gets the next day. Voters are much more tetchy, quite consumerist, willing to put someone in and take them out. And I do think, particularly our level, they are questioning a system, which for them, you have to look at it, Harry, is that has not given them any real growth since 2008. I remember when the crash happened when I was age 13 thinking, well, when I leave school, at least university, there'll probably be some jobs out there, etc. And it's never really got better in terms of all of that. And it's no wonder that people start questioning a system, which at the end of the day, it is a contract. And we may like to think democracy is a wonderful thing. It's also based on an implicit assumption, certainly in this country, of we will do better than our parents. And it has that kind of Whiggish element to it. And we haven't really seen that for about 15, 20 years or so. So I'm not surprised that people are questioning it. And this country has had a historically very high tolerance of government mismanagement, or it's been very hostile to great passions. I mean, it's been a tragedy with the recent rise in anti-Semitism. There was a great stat by Maurice Glasman last week which suggested that between 1656 and 1960 there wasn't a single Jewish person in this country killed for being a Jew. And sadly, our historic belief in liberty and parliament, etc., all of that will come under threat if we don't, frankly, deliver the stuff that people need, which keeps the public services going and keeps people's lives getting better.
So in what you just said, there's a hint of your motivations. But let's step in back a bit. What is it that gets you up in the morning? What is it that excites you about being a journalist? What's your motivation?
It's multifaceted. I love stories. I love people. And you think every day has a chance to do it. And I think in terms of, there's lots of short-term projects, long-term projects. But for me, it's this chance to sort of have a bit of fun and potentially tell some good stories in terms of getting, perhaps it could be an important story on security and where people don't feel an element of misdemeanor or wrongdoings being exposed. It could be a sort of sense of a bit of gossip which someone's told you in the corridors of power. But really it's a chance. I like working with colleagues, and I think Charles Moore, who's now my chairman, once described a happy newsroom as like a bees humming, a hive full of activity and sort of people clattering away. And there is that sense of being productive. And so it's multifaceted. It's partly I very much enjoy what I'm doing, and so that is a real privilege to work at the Spectator. But also just a chance to meet interesting people. And I think Westminster is full of people, some good, some bad, but all fascinating types. From an anthropological experiment, it's like going to Longleat or something on safari every day.
Very interesting. That's worth fleshing out a bit. So who's which animal in your safari park?
Or maybe I'd describe someone like Sir John Hayes as a sort of fantastic sort of a silverback gorilla of some kind, maybe, perhaps.
Yeah. Who's the king of the jungle?
The king of the jungle? Oh, well, I mean, I think that's got to be the PM, right, with the sort of entourage that swoops in behind him. I
suppose whoever the PM happens to be at the time.
Well, quite, and sometimes they are a sickly lion, are they not? As opposed to this great young...
The Spectator is a major institution, isn't it, in the centre-right political panoply of institutions.
Yes.
Because you're more than just a magazine, aren't you? There's a great many events held at the Spectator. What's the most memorable that you've been to at the Spectator?
Well, it was probably 2022 summer party, which was the day Boris Johnson resigned.
Oh, gosh. Of
course, our former editor. And let's just say there were a lot of heated moments between various camps at that point, because, of course, there were a lot of the exiled kings caught there, drowning their sorrows, and there were also a fair few pretenders to the crown already on manoeuvres at that point. So July 22 was probably that one. But there's been a fair few over the last 4 or 5 years or so.
So what's your take on why Boris Johnson fell?
I think that he fundamentally, people's patience snapped with him. They just couldn't take any more with credibility. And even mild-mannered ministers were going out in the media round and able to defend him. And I think we have seen that with some of the stories since then. I mean, there was a Guardian story just last month about some of his stuff. And I think people wanted to like him and thought he had many wonderful talents. I think it was Baldwin talking of Churchill when he said that the good fairy came down and blessed him with all these things, but added being impetuous, etc. And there's an element of that with Johnson. And so I just think that he had many great gifts, but also there were some weaknesses there which ultimately proved his undoing.
Yeah, it's most unfortunate. It's not very many prime ministers who see their ministers avalanche out of government, which is what in the end happened by that day, isn't it?
Yeah, and it was quite extraordinary. It was the liaison committee. And watching him sort of sit there, I mean, I did admire the majesty and the defeat with Chris Bryant going, you've got your Chancellor at number 10, so you say. And it was like this sort of great elephant with these spears being thrown at him, and I respected that in some way.
Yeah.
There was a magnificence in the madness, I'd say.
Well, there's definitely magnificence. He saved us from a huge constitutional
2019,
crisis, and that's an enormous service to our nation.
One of the greatest campaigners of our generation.
Yeah.
100%. I mean, there is... I couldn't name another British politician who possesses his charisma in
Thank
my
you,
lifetime.
Harry.
I don't even think Nigel Farage does.
No, of course not.
Well, of course, I'm sitting next to one, actually. I could...
But just unfortunately, not the man for the moment during COVID. I think it would have been very interesting if he had been Prime Minister after Brexit. If you almost
2016.
flipped him in 2016, if you flipped him and you had Boris Johnson then and then Theresa May during COVID, I think the country would be in a much better place.
Yeah, alas, it wasn't. Now, turning to lighter things.
Oh, gosh.
You wrote Steerpike for a while, didn't you?
Yes.
And tell me about Steerpike. What does it take to be a great diarist?
Strong liver. I'd say a strong liver, a good eye for a story, and a keen mind and a mischievous wit. That would be my sort of describing the body politic of a diarist. I think that what you need to do is... There's a great piece into the Times when it was 50 years of their diary, and I think it was Hugo Rifkin described diarists as the journalists. You need to be able to turn something into a sort of a diary. So I was doing 3 stories a day. The Times diary obviously has about 6 in its in every day. So it's being able to find the humour or the insight or something interesting in it.
Yes. Speak us through the kind of process for how you would get the gossip, how you get your stories, because I imagine a lot of people watching this would be fascinated to know.
Well, I mean, I always took the Glenn Larry, Glenn Ross approach of always be closing and always be trying to find a way to sort of get to the point where you get a story, be out public, make yourself known, so you can sort of being willing to talk to all sides is a good thing. And I think that if you treat people with a certain set of rules, people will come and trust you with certain stuff they want to tell you. And also just find different ways of getting stories. I mean, some of it is just gossiping over that second or third glass of wine. We might be doing basic stuff like written questions for information requests, and just always being able to find the humour and see what people are talking about. And sometimes what people are talking about explicitly, implicitly, what's behind their question is something else. And so I think being able to do that and learn from some great teams, like working with Fraser Nelson and Katie Balls, is just such a joy.
You mentioned some rules for how you deal with people. Yeah. So what are those rules?
Never reveal your sources. Always come back to people, give them a right to comment, and try to treat them with the decency that they'd expect. And if someone tells you something isn't true, in my view, and you can't find out the other way, I would tend to trust them. And if they breach that trust, then I would know not to trust them again. So that would be what I would classify, and I'd hope that most people dealing with that. Obviously, some people have different expectations and interpretations of what that ought to be, but that would be my rules and what I've learned from doing this job for 7 years or so.
I have appeared many times in Steerpike and other diary columns.
No, we've been on the receiving end of a request to comment from James.
Yeah.
Which one was that one?
There's been a couple, but I remember when Steve, you met with one of the Muslim groups.
Yeah.
That's
right.
It's one of the groups that were representative of the Muslim community.
Yeah.
And James had written a story about how ministers weren't meant to meet them.
And I just doubled down.
Yeah, you doubled down. You emailed our office. We were all in the office, or James emailed our office. We were all terrified you were going to have to resign, and so we were on frantic calls to Steve's civil service team trying to get a hold of him. I finally get a hold of Steve, and I explain the situation. Steve goes, I understand why you're worried, Harry, but that is brilliant. If I have to resign because of meeting a group like this, I'm going to win my seat by 10,000 votes.
No, the Muslim Council of Britain is controversial with people, but you've got to be able to talk to people. But the particular event I'd gone to was an event against Islamophobia, and when you represent one in five of your constituents are British Muslims, it's pretty important to stand against unjustified hatred. But that's another story for another day, and I'm supposed to be doing the interview. So, what was your funniest Steer Pike story?
It was probably going undercover at Zara Sultana's pub quiz and accidentally winning it, which was not the plan. We just did quite well on the pub quiz. And I was on there with, funny enough, another undercover journalist, and there was not one but two questions about the Spectator. And I'm on with a team with a bunch of very left-wing people who, I mean, it was the World Transformed, which was like this alternative festival next to Labour Conference 2021, and they were like hissing and booing like every mention of Tony Blair. It was quite a sort of pumped-up environment, and I got sent up on stage. It was a tiebreaker. And I think it was a Momentum press officer come out, and she's sort of squinting at me. She's like, "Have we met you before?" I was like, "No, never met before in my life." And we got put on these stools up on there, and I thought going to be sort of tried for crimes against the Inquisition or some such, and plunged in red. And of course, it was a music round, and they played the music, and it was Taylor Swift's Red. But I mean, it did feel a little bit sort of show trials of the 30s at some point.
So how does a Spectator journalist go undercover? Do you have to
I'm
wear a
picturing
donkey
glasses,
jacket?
a fake nose.
Well, two things. I mean, first of all, I'm not very well known now at all, but even at that point, I think, which came out of COVID, no one knew me at all. And second of all, my ugliest jumper, and that sort of enabled me to sort of slip under the radar,
Red
as
jumper,
it were.
of course.
No, it was actually sort of a nice sort of donkey-style black one, actually, at that time, I think. So there's a photo of me somewhere trussed up on a stool. But,
And for how long do you think you got away with it before anybody smelled?
Well, as I was coming off the stage, someone said to me, "James, you still at the Mail?" So sort of like, get me out of here, as it were. But it was good fun.
Right, brilliant. Let's talk about journalism.
Okay.
What makes a good journalist?
I think someone who is able to report accurately, interestingly, and to repeat high standards, and is able to do that in a way in which engages the reader and leaves them more informed than before, I would say, would be my sense of it.
So I've given many press briefings, as you know. You've interviewed me several times, I think. But I've always noticed that different journalists absolutely will have their own perspective. They're not merely picking up what is the news and neutrally reporting it. And you get to know different journalists. Obviously, you're a man of the utmost highest standards, of course. But other journalists...
On the CV.
Yeah. Other journalists have got a bit more of an agenda. So what's going on there with different publications and different mediums, and when it comes to who sets the agenda and the extent to which an individual journalist might have their own personal perspective that's at odds even with their own publication?
It's a good question, and this is the interesting thing about sort of, what makes a good journalist. I mean, there is a fine tradition in this country of campaigning journalism. You can go back to the 19th century, look at the Chartists, for instance. You can look at Hugh Cudlipp's Daily Mirror in the 1960s, all of this kind of stuff. I suppose it really depends there's the basics of accurate reporting. Have you got the quotes correct? Have you ensured that there's not something incredibly misleading that you haven't had there? Everyone will have their different places. I mean, the Spectator is, our motto, I think it still is, so it was firm but unfair. So there is a degree of which, you need to have, you can't just be I'd say just merely Hansard style, the full thing. So you have to make it in an interesting, engaging way. But I think you learn it. And what's interesting, of course, is when you go from, journalists can move from one title to another. I always think this is quite one reason why we haven't had this sort of level of partisanship split in the same way in American media, which is where you basically, because of the career incentives in American structures, you can spend your entire life in conservative media or entire life in liberal media. Over here, you might get a journalist who goes from The Sun to The Guardian, etc. And there is something interesting in terms of both the style and having a word count of, say, 10, 12 words a sentence to then having much longer paragraphs, The Guardian, etc. So, I mean, it's all an evolving process, and I've never been one to be gatekeeping and saying this is what journalism is and sort of the ground. I mean, I think that would be wrong and rather boring of me to do so. But I think it's very much one, we all have a code. The episode code is what we meant to stick by, and I think that journalists, ultimately you get found out. People like you have a long career, and my experience, most of my colleagues in the lobby, I think almost all of them I have been nothing but decent and pretty fair. And I think the image of the lobby, which was 20 years ago, which was that all the sort of cabal, I think that has changed a lot, I think I'd say. But
I have got a list of misconduct by some some journalists. I'm looking forward to the day I'm invited to speak to the lobby.
Oh, really? Parliamentary press club. We should get you up there, Steve. I'd love to hear that.
No, experiences vary. But I did notice you've come from the Mail. And one of the things I've noticed is that the Mail's tone tends to be, how can I put this without being written up in the Daily Mail? It's perhaps a bit shallower, more gossipy. Whereas if you get into, say, the Times, you might have a serious exposition of what policy is. So obviously newspapers driven by their readers. To what extent do you think the Spectator and other outlets are really trying to work out what their readers want and steering their writing?
I think it would be a mistake to just always think of what they would want in terms of, if you try to please someone, you often end up pleasing. If you try to please everyone, you please no one. Yeah. But obviously, we're very receptive to what our readers are saying and thinking what interesting them. It's always an evolving thing, and it's one where you can do market research, etc. It's always very hard to find out. But the best editors are often the ones who know what their readers want. Hence why we think Paul Dacre was one of the most interesting ones of the past 20, 30 years or so. It's why Fraser and now Michael are very good editors of The Spectator. I think that there's lots of different things. You can measure that in sales, you can measure that in sort of online audiences, and just making sure that you're having all those interesting conversations happening under your aegis. But I don't think there's a necessarily right answer. All I'll say is, given the cutthroat world of Fleet Street, first of all, it makes Premier League managers look like lasting symbols of endurance. But second of all, if you're not very good, you get found out pretty quickly.
So let's drill into that cutthroat world. How does it manifest itself? Because I think if you're a member of the public trying to work out how, what people say, they say that the mainstream media is failing or has a wrong narrative or whatever. How does that cutthroat nature of the business manifest itself to you as a journalist?
Well, I think there's always a pressure to get good stories, to get interesting things. And also, of course, we're now in an age where there is so much competition, and sort of the old distinctions. You'll have seen this in your career, Steve, where you previously had the papers and then the blogs. It's much more sort of back and forth right now, much more of a kind of revolving door, if you want to consider it like that. The old barriers. I mean, my co-author on the Liz Truss book was Harry Cole. Started out at the Guido Fawkes blog, went on, and now the paper's editor-at-large in America. So the old distinctions, basically, it's much more of a sense of, if you're good enough, you'll get there. And I think nowadays, you see interesting things such as Robert Jenrick's TfL stunt. He was creating a conversation and basically getting the media to follow him on that. So I think now much more it's far less the kind of world of House of Cards where I'm watching the 1990 version where the reporter gets her story killed because she can't go to one of 3 newspapers. It's very different now. Nowadays, if Maddie Storring wanted to tweet something, she just tweet it, bang, it'll be up there.
There we go. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So how do you think a journalist's time breaks down between putting stuff in print, blogging, doing podcasts as the host or perhaps as the interviewee is in this case? How does time actually break down? Because you're under immense pressure.
Well, I think it's probably about 50-50 really is what I would describe as sort of working in the terms of content production and 50% talking to people and understanding what's going on and reading. And that's the key thing, I think, is, I'm lucky to be at a place where you can have that time and space to sort of read documents, talk to people, understand different sides, what's going on. Everyone has their way of doing this job differently. I've always found that it's good to talk to Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, Reform, and try to get a sense of where they're all coming from and empathise with that and say, this is what they think. It may not be what you agree. It may be even the facts subsequently prove they were not telling entirely the truth, etc. But this is what they think. And then trying to get across multi-platforms, because I think that's the best way to survive in this business, right? And that would be my advice to anyone who wants to get into journalism, is having that ability to tweet and video and blog and write for hard copy as well. I think as journalists we all romanticise print because that's what we grew up on. That's where we see all the president's men, etc. But we have to be everything across everything. And more 18 to 24-year-olds now get their news from video than text-based sources. Yeah,
and that really struck me. It's not any good any longer to just be good in print, right? Precisely, you have to also be a good presenter on video.
Yeah. And do you think that some of those pressures to be a good presenter on video, to do so many different aspects in terms of content alongside actually print stories as well, do you think some of one of the reasons why there's less of a focus on kind of long-term issues within journalism is simply because of those daily pressures?
I think that that's a fair point, and I think that one of the criticisms of the system we have is often because it's news, it by nature presents novelty sometimes at the expense of other factors. Equally, I would say that the media, or certainly the formal media, the professional media, if you want to call it that, people working in media full time, is not alone in that. And I do think we have seen much too much short-termism in policy making over the last 10, 15 years. So the media is a part of that, clearly, but I think other pressures are to blame as well. And as things get worse in politics, the demand gets much more intense, even as potentially the delivery takes much longer to see forward.
Well, let's talk about short-termism and let's talk about politics. And when you say things get worse in politics, what do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that you have wage growth in real terms declining or stagnating. And as a result of that, given the demographic pressures on us, you have a much growing a state which expands even while the provision of those services gets worse and worse and worse. You get less bang for your buck. I think public service reform has featured heavily for the past 10 years or so, since the schools reform of the coalition government. And I think that people would say in polls that our country's on the wrong course, and that sense of decline is something that certainly American friends, when they come over, think is almost palpable.
As we come up to time, 2 final questions.
Sure.
First, suppose we look ahead, Reform has won 350 seats.
Yep.
Tell us about the pressures you think those brand new MPs will face, particularly those who need to go straight into government or even the cabinet.
They will face, I think, pressures twofold. One in which public pressures to influence them. They will be new to Westminster. They won't not know what goes on. And I think that they'll be influenced to kind of come up with views on votes and ideologies and factions, etc. But they'll also have the personal pressures of going to Westminster. And I think there was a stat which, of the 2010 intake, I think something like 1 in 6 of the relationships had failed within 18 months or something like that. Conservative Home did some work on this. And that will be, both of those will change that, and that will shape the outcome because parliamentary parties require management. So there will be, I think, if talking to some people in Reform, they wanted to have like an agenda which they'd put forward and they'd vote as quickly as possible to get it through, because the longer things go on, MPs have this curious habit of thinking for themselves and can often get led astray, either in the sort of illicit sense or in the sense of not obeying what the whips want to do. And I think there was once a rising,
never noticed that.
a rising young star who, within about 18 months, had organised a massive rebellion of 81 on the EU referendum.
That may have happened. Douglas Carswell put me up to that one, but I was glad to do it. Now, do you think journalists will give new Reform MPs, any leeway? Will they be cut any slack?
I think there'll be a degree of slack with the new government. I think you get that with it. People recognise that there's someone's just commanded a majority, but ultimately you'd think that most journalists will hold them to the same standards as they held the New Labour ones and the Tory ones.
Do you think there'll almost be a culture shock when Reform come into power in terms of with the journalist class, simply because it's just the complete opposite of what's been used to for most of their careers?
I think that's a fair comment. I think that last year more MPs than not were new MPs. That was a huge, and even the Speaker was there looking at his book for weeks afterwards, trying to work out who was speaking. It's hard, and obviously, and this is a people business, and so that will take a big shock to all of us.
James, this has been absolutely fascinating. There's a chance this podcast will be watched by young people who aspire to journalism. What advice would you give them?
I think work hard. Be interested, read what you want to get into. If you want to work for The Spectator, read The Spectator, find out what's going on. And as one senior editor said to me, always buy the editor a drink. And just learn from what you can, read all this stuff, and be like a sponge. And if you like newsroom, it's like anything, the more you enjoy it, you'll want to get more involved, and it's a virtuous circle from there.
Well, James Heale from The Spectator, thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fascinating. This has been The Insurgency with me, Steve Baker, and our director, Harry Richer. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please like, please subscribe, please share.
We hope you're enjoying The Insurgency with Steve Baker. We've had so many wonderful guests on the show, and we hope you're enjoying all the content we're putting out.
We also have our Substack and a community and educational programmes, but you can also get merchandise. If you would like a Fighting for a Free Future mug or baseball cap or, yes, T-shirt explaining that taxation is worse than theft, please visit our store. We've just had a fantastic interview, and there will be an extended version available on the Substack.